Hello and welcome to this special episode of the Adoption and Fostering Podcast with me, Scott Casson-Rennie, and in
Al Coates.
Al Coates.
Oh, it's very special. I have to say we're in slightly unusual rooms, so the audio's a bit like you're in a cave and I'm in a sort of dungeon.
I'm in a cave. I didn't actually tell you why I'm in a cave. It's because there's 3 kittens in my bedroom and they've now started to run round. And it sounds like elephants on a wooden floor. So I thought, I'm just not doing that tonight. I can't be bothered with it. So I've come downstairs tonight.
You are going to start a sanctuary, aren't you? Like a cat sanctuary. Like you'd be the cat men of Ireland.
No, these ones have been found homes. And as soon as they're ready, they're off. And it's actually quite cruel because I find myself not wanting to engage with them too much just in case I get attached. So,
because you need more cats in your life. Yeah, desperately need more cats.
My friend actually said, have you doubled the number of animals to humans in your household now? I was like, no, we're not going to have that.
Well, that's fair enough. It's fair enough. So, Scott, we've got an interview with Josh MacAlister. Now, we're recording this before we've had our interview, so it could be a car crash, couldn't it?
Well, it could be. Or it could not be a car crash.
Well, I'm glad we're putting it in such binary terms. It's either on or off, good or bad, black or white.
Actually, can I just say before we go into that, the guy from Home Alone, that is who I'm looking at. What is his name?
Is it Merv?
Yeah, Merv. I'm Merv from Home Alone. That is what Al is currently looking like. He's going through a restyle? I'm not sure, really. It's decided that without hair, I look like I've got radiation poisoning and frightened children, which is not a great look when you're a social worker who works occasionally with children. So we decided we'd grow my hair out. And so actually, no one's seen me without my hat on. You're probably the first person. When I first logged in, I was like, oh, okay, it's a vagrant off the streets. It's not usual.
I can't believe we're having this conversation on the one where like new listeners will be listening to us and thinking, right, we're in for like a really serious conversation about, the care review.
But there's a side to this. I need to know, are you going to be starting to kind of style the hair when it gets to a certain length? Are you going to get a hair dryer? Are you going to backcomb it? What's the plan?
Backcomb my hair. It's like 1987 all over again.
Listen, you have to remember, my hair, maybe not quite as thin as yours because I'm a little bit younger, but at the front, the front is quite thin as well, like yours. And
it'll tough.
Look how thick it looks from a bit of blow drying. Honestly, works wonders, love. You should try it. Get Paula on it. She's a hairdresser.
I confess to having used wax, styling wax.
Ooh,
which brings out my curls. Stupid boy.
All right.
This is a terrible introduction.
I know. No, it's not actually. It really isn't. But yeah. We're here for some serious talk now.
Serious chat.
I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah. Well, we've been having quite a long conversation about having a conversation with Josh, and we asked it. He came on a year ago, wasn't it? I think it was last June. And
was it that long?
Yeah. Back when we were all young and happy.
Yeah.
And so we asked him if he'd come on. He said yes. That's it. I think the caveat to all of this is that we are the Fostering and Adoption podcast. We're going to focus in on what we know about. We're not going to stray off into areas that we're not particularly well versed in. So we're going to stick to fostering, adoption, and probably kinship care and special guardianships. We are not looking for gotcha moments.
No.
Are we?
Well, unless we can get a scoop, I don't think we should, see, the thing is, and we said this last time as well, we definitely did say this last time that, we are not journalists and we don't get paid for this and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, sorry, email come through there. We're doing it because it's something of interest to us. And we always say podcasts like no one's listening. So, last year, someone transcribed the podcast, which was, actually, I think a follower. The lady who I can't remember her name.
Totally reasonable thing to do.
Actually, when we put, because transcribing something without the context, you can't really do it. So, it's just, we're only going to talk about what's interesting to us. There's not, in the same way that
not the BBC.
In the same way that the care review hasn't brought up anything particularly that I'm like, don't expect anything like that from us today. Or this interview that's coming up. So, yeah, I mean, we don't know how it's going to go. So we might have to scrap this. It might turn out into a proper bun fight, mightn't it? We have to do and we're really sorry about this interview, but it's the best we could get.
If it did go like that.
He walked out. He'll not walk out. He's far too professional for that. He's a lovely young man. Yeah. So let's... we've got our own aspirations and hopes in the interview. We're just going to aim towards them. And so here we are. We're going to do the interview with Josh MacAlister, who was the chair of the Independent Care Review. So,
and as they say, don't at us because we're not interested.
Don't what?
Don't at us. That's what they say, isn't it?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
You know when you can tag something and you start kind of,
right.
Don't at us. I think that's the phrase they use.
You're so down with the kids.
Don't say that. Don't say that. Got told off for that. Not allowed to say that anymore.
Which part of it is offensive? Down with
any of
kids?
It. I'm not allowed to say that I'm down with the kids. I've been told off by a 15-year-old who says I'm not down with the kids. And any phrases that I use, I'm not allowed to do anymore. Whether it be in writing or verbally. So, of course, I keep doing it. Just
it's so boring being a teenager. Well, here we go. We'll crack on. We'll press record. We'll maybe feed. I don't think we need to do any feedback over this. We'll just let it stand. We'll maybe do a podcast.
Let's leave it.
Run away! And then next week we're doing the children's minister.
No, please stop. I can feel my brain just.
And you had to send a photograph of me without my permission.
Yes.
So the minister can recognise us. What's that for?
Yeah, I had to send our biographies, which actually, thankfully, we'd written, but a month ago? Not for that specifically. It's because, we've got other things that we do.
Generally.
And our images as well. I sent a really good, gorgeous one of me, of course. I was in my hospital gown.
And you Google imaged the guy off Home Alone and sent that to him of me.
I sent him one of me in my hospital gown, my arse hanging out the back of it. No, I didn't. I sent him a really gorgeous one of me with, all filtered and stuff. And then I just sent a rough one of you, to be honest.
Yeah, me looking like a petty criminal.
Yeah, exactly.
Excellent. Anyway, we will put. Here's the podcast. Here's the interview with Josh. Now we will do it. Honestly, we can't. This is about our podcast. We like to talk. Right, here we go. Here's Josh. Hello, Josh. Thank you very much for agreeing to come back on the podcast after being on a year ago. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's been a busy 15 months. I think I spoke to you last summer.
Yep.
And there's been a lot's happened in that time. So yeah, it's really good to be back.
Excellent. You've sort of come to the end of your tenure now, aren't you? You're sort of winding down in your job. So how long are you going to be still sort of linked to the care review?
I don't know. It's a good question. It's sort of what I do next. And I'm keen to find ways to keep the momentum up behind the recommendations that we've made.
Right.
And find ways to kind of push it on, both in government and outside of government with local authorities and other public services and businesses and the public. And unlike lots of other reviewers, I'm not of retirement age. So I do need to figure out what I'm going to do next for work. But it's been such a full-on 15 months that I'm also just having a bit of a slower pace of life for the moment. So yeah, hoping to carry on being involved in some way, helping government and local authorities and others figure out how they might implement the recommendations.
Smashing. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Scott, who's going to, I believe he's got the first question.
Esteemed. Let's not push it. But anyway, so Josh, I guess first question that we wanted to ask was about the response to the review, because obviously it's come out, whether you've just read the executive summary or whether you've read the full thing and all the kind of bits and bobs that come with it. But what has the response been like? Is it what you hoped for? Is it better? Is it worse? What's the story?
The response has been what I'd hoped for, which is the reviews tried to wrestle with some long-term problems that families and children and people that work in children's social care have felt and seen for a long time, which is a system increasingly tilted to late crisis intervention that feels a bit out of control, where the people working in it are not doing the work they came into it to do, and where families are not getting help at the right time and children in care don't get the connection and love that they need in their life. And I think for a lot of people, and it'll never be the case that everybody would look at it and say, yes, that's got everything in it that I wanted to see. But for a lot of people, I think they can see the stories they've shared with the review reflected in the recommendations that we've made. And I think there's a bit of excitement about it and a bit of energy that now we've got a plan that's on the table and it's with government and they're taking a few months to consider it and respond to it, that maybe there's a chance here for us to turn the corner and actually, as a country, try and get children's social care back into a place where it needs to be. So whether you look at big children's charities, some big employers and private businesses like John Lewis, whether you look at local authorities and the LGA and the Association of Directors of Children's Services, whether you look at the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, I think there's a widespread recognition that this is the right plan. And the trick now is, can we actually implement it? Can we make it happen?
Mm. That seems interesting, because I've read a lot of the responses, and I think there's there's two halves to the responses. There's the sort of social media responses, which have been from individuals who are not necessarily aligned with organisations. Have been, there's an element of confirmation bias that it was exactly what they thought it would be. You know, that they've seen things in it that they're concerned about or unpicked holes. But then the big organisations which you've mentioned, I'm conscious that. It's interesting you say enthusiastic, because I would say it reads cautious to me, that it's, like kinship. I listened to Kinships and they said, well, we like the bits about us, we're not sure about the other bits. And, Adoption UK have sort of said, well, it wasn't much for us there. And so in a sense, do you think that people are genuinely behind this? Do you think that there is an element of a move for change, or do you think that people are just conscious that actually what they think, they need to be on board with it because they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. They don't want to upset the government by saying, "Oh, this is a pile of nonsense."
Yeah, I think it's less the latter, because a lot of the organisations that you just mentioned, Al, are stuck into this work. It's their life, and they've got lots of people who really care about these issues and live and breathe them every day, either as professionals working in the system or because they themselves have adopted a kid or been adopted or whatever their personal connection might be. And when a review like this comes along, and I've been on the other side of it, in my previous role at Frontline, when there were reviews of social work education or reviews of other bits of children's social care, you think, well, I really hope that in this review, it's going to do the following things that, from my perspective on the world, I think are needed. And I think a lot of organisations have thought that. Now, I think I actually said when I spoke to you guys last summer, if the approach to the review was to sort of take a lowest common denominator approach of only recommending the things that would get everybody supportive, I would have done a review that had lots of pretty bland, broad statements as recommendations. Mm-hmm. The problem with that is it doesn't give you any detail of how they'd happen, how you'd implement it. And we've tried to get into that detail. And the second you start to do that, organizations say, well, this particular group are not going to be supported in a way that we'd want. And when you get into that detail, you end up with people maybe being supportive of large parts of it and having a disappointment with another bit. That is just inherent when you're doing a big review of a complex system. But I guess just to slightly push on that, Al, Kinship's response, for example, I think is very positive. There are examples of areas where they would, say, whether it's about educational support or whatever, that we should have gone further. But I think they recognise that we've done a pretty comprehensive job of recommending things there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the kinship is probably the area around kinship care and special guardianships, I think, is probably the high point for me personally. But I mean, that's that. I believe Scott has now got another question. I'm prompting Scott.
This is very ordered.
It makes a change for us. My question isn't on the list, and I just wanted to, so that's going to swell off a little bit. But I guess I'd be interested to know, I mean, from what you came in to do and your expectations of it, was there kind of any big, massive surprises in it? Or, I mean, for me, looking at it, it just seems quite obvious, having read what I've read, that, some of the stuff that is fact, there was no kind of surprise on some of the stuff. But was there anything that kind of sticks out for you that you think, okay, yeah, I wasn't expecting to, to experience, to have that kind of come up, or,
Well, I think that towards the end of the review, when we were doing the analysis for the cost benefit model, so how much money, is needed in order to achieve the outcomes that we were looking at. And a big part of that is trying to shift the system over 5 years so that we spend more of the money in it on earlier help for families, was just how far we've gone in gathering evidence in the last decade or so about the effectiveness of spending money intensively helping families earlier on, and how that can reduce the need for care later. And when you start to sort of put that in real terms into a model that shows if you put money into this bit of the system, actually it makes it more sustainable, improves outcomes, and shifts where money is spent. Doing that exercise with some, great economists from Alma Economics who we worked with, and the civil service team on the review, I think it surprised me how robust that conclusion from that model is. And we've taken a really conservative approach with those numbers. So we've not tried to sort of say fancifully, if you spend money on a model like family safeguarding from Hertfordshire, everywhere, you would see 100% of the benefits. In fact, we only said you'd see 50% of the benefits. And even with that, this model still stacks up. So that was an area where, going into it, we hadn't done that calculation. We didn't know whether that would work out. And if it didn't, that would have been a big moment of pause for us in the review about how we were approaching it. So that was a big surprise. And then I guess the thing that I've learned the most about over the last 15 months is kinship, and I guess more broadly how, what happens when children go into care and their relationships with their birth families and all of that connection that they've had. And I think that the conversations, the stories I've heard from people who've lived through those experiences, and then zooming out and looking at how England's compares with other countries in its support for kinship carers, which is, we're an outlier. We don't do very much support at all for kinship arrangements. And then looking at the current system, where we know we've got more children in care now than we've had for a long time, and lots of children who are in care and young people who have recently been in care have told me pretty resoundingly that experience has often left them isolated, lonely, and lacking connection. And sort of putting all of those bits together, I think you're right in a way, Scott. Like, you look at it and you think, well, that's pretty common sense. But up until now, we've not had a plan of how to change it, nationally at least.
You mentioned lots of things there that I'd like to pick up, but I have one question sort of before we get into the nuts and bolts, if possible. Just, can you tell me the process of actually completing the review? Did you have a draft review that you then had to submit for sort of approval to the government? Or was it, did they get to say, hey, you can't put that in? Or was there anything like that? Or was it literally you went one day and just handed it over, whacked it on the desk?
No, I didn't just hand over a final version. I did share earlier drafts with government, because what you want to do is you want to get not just ministers, but you also want to get officials, so civil servants who have got expertise in a particular area, understanding the argument that you're making, and actually occasionally saying, I don't think that's quite right. Actually, I think you should frame it like this, because that is a more accurate reflection of the problem. And have you seen this bit of evidence? So we did do that process, and that's why, doing that process, I think, got us into a position on the publication day where the oral statement from the government committed to a number of things that we asked for in the report. So it meant that we could get some momentum going quite quickly. Now, what absolutely did not happen at any point in time, and I can see
that was my next question, really.
I know where you're going with this, is they didn't say, you can't say that, or we don't want you to be critical of us in this way. That did not happen. And they were really clear from me that was not the basis of us sharing some of the early thinking with them. It was so that they could be ready to respond fully to the review as early as possible.
Right. So, I mean, that's a clear sort of statement from you that the government didn't ask you to remove something because it was embarrassing or uncomfortable for them.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think they, to their credit, they realised that when they appointed it as an independent review, that was what they were gonna get. They were keen to work as closely as possible with the review. And as a reviewer, I've said right from the beginning, I'm doing this because I want to see things change, and we need to see things change urgently. And that process of dialogue with government is an important one if you're going to try and get things moving at pace. In doing that, you've got to make sure you're holding firm on what it is you're wanting to say, and making sure that that's clear and that's coming through. And I'm really happy with the approach that we took to that in the review.
Because we're 2 years out from an election and potential change of parliament, change of government. So is there a real sense of wanting to get to some sort of effective and meaningful change prior to that? And is there any, is that what's driving all of this?
Well, what's driving all of this is that the biggest asset we have as human beings to spend on things is time. Where do we spend our time? And that is true for individuals and it's true for government. And we desperately need to see change happen in this system. It is not good enough. There are children waking up in children's homes today, without the support or the connection they need. There are children, who are not being given the foster carers they need right now because we don't have the range of foster carers available. There are families who've got really serious issues and need help and are not getting that help, right now. So there is just an urgency with doing this work. We've said in the review that the reform plan with the investment is 5 years. It's going to take 5 years. That means it will obviously run over more than one parliament, but we need to get going and we need to get started on it. And government's got about 50 reviews or so. I'm making that up. I don't know how many reviews, but it's got lots of reviews underway, all having been published. And you've got to fight for this issue to get focus and to be prioritised. So the urgency for me is we've got to get going now. And it's going to run over another parliament, but we've got to make sure the next 2 years the Department for Education in particular has a focus on these issues and makes some proper progress on it. And if we don't, what will happen is this will start to sit on a shelf, it'll start to gather dust. You'll have an election, and I think we talked about this last time, you'll have an election, and whichever party wins, whether it's Labour or the Conservatives, the debate, the momentum will have moved on somewhere else. And
it's a frenetic environment, isn't it? And we see that in some ways, some of these issues are becoming almost part of a culture war. When you look at schools and, all of that, it's all in the mix of a very different environment. I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague again for another question, because he often complains I talk too much. So I'm trying to create space.
On the feedback here.
Yeah. My annual appraisal, Stu.
So I guess in terms of the recommendations, and I mean, like I've got lots of questions, but trying to stick to a bit of a script here, I guess. Let's say 5 years from now, let's hope that, if there is a change of government, that civil servants are really keen to because, they don't change, do they? It's just the politicians that will change, but the people who work directly with some of this stuff will remain the same. But which one of the recommendations 5 years from now would you like to see implemented? I know it's hard to just say one. I mean, you can pick 5 if you want, but we haven't got all day. So,
but it might come down to that the government will we come down to a position where the government say, right, we're going to pick these 5. These are the ones we think we've got bipartisan sort of agreement on that's going to steer the course. So go on, 5. Go on. Off the top of your head.
We've gone from 1 to 5. I'm hoping if I hold the silence a bit longer, you'll give me 10.
All right, 3. If you're going to take that attitude, 3.
Well, the thing it's a complex system, and changing it requires work on every front, pretty much. And it's why the report's got over 80 recommendations. It's why we've put the time into working up an implementation plan. It's why we've done the cost benefit analysis. So it's why we've taken the review quite far down the line of detail about how you'd implement it. Because, for example, if we try and improve, and I'll just give you one example here, the way in which we plan for and build and run residential care. And you do that at a time when the use of residential care in England is very high, and much higher than it is in Scotland and Wales. And when those homes are not in the right part of the country, if you try and solve that issue by itself in isolation without looking at how we improve fostering and the number of foster carers and the support for foster carers, and at the same time the support for kinship carers, you're not going to be able to make the changes within residential care without doing improvements to those connected parallel bits of the care system. And this is why the review of the whole system has been it was such a good thing that the remit for the review was so broad, because it gives you the chance to look at the system in its entirety. So that's the caveat. With that caveat, the things that I think I would really want to see implemented in a big way, one would be the family help recommendations.
Yeah.
The call for a comprehensive family help service, which would be multidisciplinary, so not just social workers working with families on a child in need plan. Getting rid of some of the overlapping gatekeeping and assessment between targeted early help and child in need work, and simplifying that so that it is with the intention as the 89 Act set out. And that those services would be based in community settings using really well evidenced models to support families that have got particular issues.
And how does that differ from the Sure Start? Because we had Sure Starts which, frankly, the government slashed.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of coming along going, hey, I've got this really good idea. Let's call it something else. But it's...
No, it's not. Well, it's not Sure Start. I mean, the parallel with Sure Start would be family hubs.
Yeah.
And the family hubs policy, which is more universal as a service. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as part of the children's social care system. It's definitely part of children's services. But what we're describing...
What's the difference between the two? Because children's services and children's social care, where does one end and the other start?
Well, good question. In the report, we set out what we think the purpose of children's social care should be, which is to ensure that children have got the ability to grow up in their families with safety, stability and love. And if they don't have that and can't get that from their families, that the care system can provide the same foundations. Now, children's services more broadly includes education, wider community services that are universal. We've, in the family help model that we've set out in the review, described something that is trying to get back to the intention of Section 17 of the Children Act, which is where children are at risk of not reaching a reasonable level of development. And, we've drifted a long way from that original intention in the Act to where we are now, where I think lots of social workers would recognise and families would recognise that child in need plans are often very assessment driven, don't come with much help.
Reactive.
Quite reactive, exactly. Almost seen as a sort of precursor to a child protection plan. So
yeah,
it might end up being a child protection plan. For lots of families it will, and will kind of monitor decline for a period before it reaches that crisis point. actually one of the things we found was that in some areas, there's more help in targeted early help and more money being spent. And then when things escalate and it's a child in need, the help dips off, the support dips off until you get to child protection when it comes back up again. So some of this is about kind of how the system's designed. And that's one of the big things we're saying needs to change. So it is different from Sure Start.
So then is it in part trying to get uniformity across the system? Because there is an element of it being a postcode, isn't it? That you may go to one authority and get kind of a relatively good service or a good service, or an outstanding service. You go to the next borough down, authority down, and you get a different system, a different structure, or it's the same names but different, constituted differently, different focus, different staffing. Are you wanting to try and bring a uniformity and kind of reset the counter to zero?
Well, in family help, it's an interesting question, because one of the things that we see is that there are examples of too much uniformity in some parts of it. So, for example, big county councils that have got a contract with a voluntary sector organisation to run parenting programmes. Mm-hmm. And
don't get Scott started on parenting programmes.
Right. Okay. Here you go. So
he has flashbacks. We're not allowed to mention it.
Okay. So, well, I mean, this might be linked to your experience, Scott. But we had lots of parents talk to us about their experience of services in the review and say they had really quite particular issues with how they were raising their kids and what was going on for them in their lives. And all that was on offer and all that they were told to go to by services was a parenting class. And they did that, they kind of complied, they went along with it, and it didn't help. And they'd said that at the beginning. And then when it didn't work and they were still asking for help, they were told to go back again or do a different one. And that, I think, there's lots going on in that if you unpack it. I think part of it, though, is that the number of services available to help families is reduced so much in that part of the system that almost as a way of justifying the process, social workers end up saying, look, I've made a referral for you to go and do this thing because it's a thing you can do, and I can say you've got a thing to go and do. And the family are left bewildered saying, I've come to you with a problem. My problem is about, my mental health needs and my housing situation. And you're telling me that I need to be taught about boundary setting and rewarding. And so I just, it's
there's not a family in their right mind that would, no one would willingly go to children's social care. You'd have to be at the very end. It's the last resort, just because of the rep that it's got. Yeah. So do we need a whole culture? We need a whole culture change.
Well, that massively needs to change. This is why the family help recommendation, I think, is so potentially significant, because we're saying that they need to be based in community settings where it's not just social workers doing the work. The recommendations, if they come to pass, will see extra spending of £1 billion a year in England on those services. The inspection of those services will be based on an understanding that they've got of their local community, and then building the services to meet the needs of families in that area and properly digging into whether that's happening. And then crucially, when there is significant harm, so in child protection cases where it often gets really acrimonious between services and families, that is not a decision that we're just mixing in amongst this broader work of support for families. We're saying expert practitioner roles should co-work with family help when that happens. And it's those expert practitioners that should be making those decisions. And I think this, if you take the position of a family that might be wanting to ask for some help, but being worried about what that might mean for how they are judged or stigmatized, that clearer distinction between the majority of families who need intensive help in the system and the minority who might be at risk of causing significant harm or causing significant harm.
Yeah.
That's a really important distinction that it's a bit of a muddle at the moment. And I think that will be one of the big changes that would help that for families.
I mean, that sounds really encouraging, because I think that there is people, just my experience as a family and the community that we come from, is that people just very reluctant to knock on that door.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're going to get.
Exactly.
You could things escalate really quickly. People lose control, and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
To put it mildly.
You lose complete control. I mean, we've heard that a lot in the review through various bits of work that we did. Scott, what was your parenting program?
Well, I was kind of joking, but I mean, to be honest, when in my previous role, that was a very common thing that people were sent on parenting courses, even as adoptive parents, and whilst it's very similar to what we've just said there, it was a thing to do and a box to tick to say, well, this is the support that they've been given, but actually it's more direct support. And I think that's, I'm listening to what you're saying, and I'm totally getting what you're saying, and I can see the benefits in this. But of course, I'm just thinking, as a typical Scotsman, about money, and thinking, there are going to be areas in England that are less well off and are going to need more cash to be able to deliver these services, compared to other areas aren't going to need as much. And, I guess what I'm jumping ahead here a little bit, but there was the mention of kind of more of a regional kind of approach to this. I don't think that's how it was worded, but it sounded to me like regionalisation of like the system,
fostering,
well, not the system, but of the support and looking after children. Regional care cooperatives, that's what it's called.
Yeah,
I did highlight it. See, I actually did some work on this one. Look,
he did
a lot of words on that page.
So I guess taking that into account and thinking about some of the areas in England, and I hate using words like deprived and working class and all that sort of stuff, because that shouldn't come into it. But if it's going to work, then it has to be, these places we have to take into account. It's not just right, there's, I don't know, 200 grand to you, here's 200 grand to you, here's 200 grand to you. It needs to be really well thought through. And I guess that's part of my concern is that it doesn't happen like that. Yeah. And it's just a case of, right, so every local authority is going to get this much cash to bring themselves up to a standard. And of course, the other thing, sorry, I'm ranting now. I did say I was being more direct than I used to be. Sorry about this, John.
Go for it.
I don't think I'm being out of order, though.
No, we'd stop you.
Have we got the workforce to be able to fill these prospective new roles? Because, if you think about some of the experiences of adoptive parents as an example, bearing in mind we're the Adoption and Fostering podcast, so this is our experience and this is who we hear from. Yeah. Safeguarding issues are taken as in the same way as any other safeguarding issues. That's not to say that shouldn't be the case, but allegations, etc., for foster carers, how they dealt with, etc., etc. So there's lots in there to unpick. I guess these are just kind of some of the things I'm thinking of in terms of, if, like you say, if we're sending somebody on a parenting course, it's just literally to tick a box. The chances are they need something else, like their mental health needs to be.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, that's
I feel like I need to make a tiny defense of parenting classes as well, because they can be. I mean, you both know this, right? They can be super helpful. It's when they're being used to kind of, as we say, show something is happening even when it's not the right response. Well, we're hopping around a bit, which is fine. And in a way, your question, Scott, goes back to something that Al was mentioning a minute ago about kind of consistency and whether this is about trying to get consistency into the system. When we looked at what should be done locally, what should be done regionally, what should be done nationally, this was one of the dilemmas that the review was wrestling with, and we had a debate about it. We did lots of roundtables and discussions about it. And I think that where I landed was that there are some parts of children's social care that need to be even more local than they are at the moment. Mm-hmm. And that one of those areas is family help, where the needs of a particular neighbourhood, the relationships that you need to have with the head teachers and the GPs and the community organisations the knowledge of where kids hang out, where it is that families congregate, faith groups, all of that rich knowledge that helps you understand how you're going to meet the needs of that community need to be even more local than they are at the moment. And actually just operating as one local authority doing things in one way is probably too distant from that model. So there are recommendations about making the system hyper-local at one end of the spectrum. And then there are some areas where what we need to do is work at a bigger level, at a regional level. And that's the example which is most obvious for that is recruiting foster carers, training foster carers, building children's homes, commissioning children's homes, and that those things are so specialist and require scale, because particularly with residential care, you need to have the confidence to plan for the types of care that are needed in the future. And doing that as an individual local authority, you don't have that confidence, because it might be in 5 years you don't have very many children at all that you think might need this type of home. But for the very small number of children who will need that home, you need to make sure you're planning for it. And that's the kind of bind that individual local authorities are in at the moment. So that's why, and maybe we can talk a bit more about regional care cooperatives in a moment and how they might work. But we've tried to not just say, okay, the whole system either needs to be more consistent or needs to be more local. We've said there are different answers for different parts of the system. And part of that and the funding for that needs to be a recognition that in some parts of the country, the financial position of the local authority is so vulnerable that they can't make these changes happen unless they're given a disproportionate level of funding. We actually say in the report the formula for funding local authorities for children's social care needs to change to reflect that. And we also say that the £2.6 billion reform programme needs to be geared towards areas with higher deprivation. And again, to underpin that, we set out the evidence that's been growing for some years now about the link between poverty and high rates of neglect and high rates of care.
Because I'm reflecting on our conversation last year, and you were quite clear that there wasn't there was a correlation, but not necessarily a causation about funding. There was and levels of deprivation, and it was a really complicated picture. But I was quite encouraged to see that you came down on the fact that actually we need more money. Full stop. There wasn't like a caveat. It was like, we need more money, and this isn't the place we need it. But if we could move on to the care cooperatives, because I think that's a really interesting idea. And is that in any way inspired by the regionalisation of adoption agencies? Is that there? Also, there was a couple of concerns that I saw, and maybe I'll ask you a series of questions and you can answer them the best you can. I feel like there's so much to cover, so I apologise, dear listener, that we're flitting over and people are going, ask him about this.
And I need to answer the workforce question as well, but you go first, and then I'll try.
The workforce question is an interesting one as a social worker, but I'm not sure how interested our listeners are. I'm sure our core listeners, there'll be people who dip in to find out.
Scott doesn't look too upset that you're basically poo-pooing his question, but that's
Scott's just wishing I would stop talking. He's used to it. And so with the regional, because I think fostering is our bread and butter. So one of the concerns is that you've got regionalised agencies, so you've got children moving within regions, and some of those regions are big. You've got children moving out of like a 20-mile radius of their home, and I think that's a concern. You raised questions about you talking about windfall tax, which is great in relation to the social care providers, the fostering providers, but that's for now. How are you going to ensure that they don't continue to just gouge out profits? What's your plan beyond the 5 years? And where do IFAs sit in that? Independent foster care agencies, would you see them as part of those cooperatives, which is what we've done in regionalisation for adoption? We've got these sort of maybe slightly awkward alliances. Anyway, lots of questions there.
It's it follows a similar logic to adoption and the adoption reforms, where there's a recognition that doing this at the scale of a local authority might not be the right level, and actually doing it as groups would be more would be more powerful. So it follows that same logic. And the recommendation here for a regional care cooperative in every area is still a local authority run, still a local authority led system. It's saying band together, because you don't necessarily have the capability as individual local authorities to do some of the things that are really technical and hard to get right. And you don't have the scale, and we talked about scale a minute ago, and some of the sort of ability to plan into the future and get the sorts of care options that children need. For example, teenagers, the fastest growing group in care, and making sure there are children's homes that are a good option for them and that there are fostering options. The two concerns that you've raised are the two concerns which we were thinking about when we were drafting this recommendation and working it up. And of course, the current system, which is a local led system, so local authorities run it, 40% of children live out of area in care.
Yeah.
So a local system, a local run system, doesn't follow that means children get to stay locally in their community. And actually, it's one of the problems we need to address. Children need to be, if it's the right option for them, and it will be the right option for the vast majority of children, to, of course, be connected to their school and their friends and their wider family networks if they come into care. The problem we've got at the moment is we don't have local authorities with the capability to do enough recruitment and have the intelligence about knowing where to do recruitment of foster carers in the current system. So, a lot of local authorities, I think over 40% of local authorities, haven't even got a published sufficiency plan for where they need care in the future. So the starting point is scale doesn't necessarily mean children will live anywhere within a region. And we say that the Ofsted framework, inspection framework for regional care cooperatives, would need to look really, really closely at the proportion of children that are living close to where they grew up, and that number should be as high as possible. And it should be one of the key metrics for understanding whether regional care cooperatives are working. Now, that isn't something that we're currently obsessed about in a system that's locally led. So I just really clear, it doesn't follow that a regional care cooperative model means that children will live further away from home. Yeah. That logic doesn't stack up. And the second point on profiteering, which is a concern at the moment in the system, and I've said really clearly, I don't think children's social care should be a system based on profit. What we see in other parts of the UK where they have the available foster homes and residential homes for children who might need it. So they've got, in the language of markets, they've got the sufficiency in the system. Supply and demand are much better matched. The level of profit being made is much lower. What we've got at the moment in England is we've got high demand for residential care, partly driven by the fact that we don't have enough foster care. And all of that's being driven by the fact that we've got record levels of children in care. And some of that is being driven by the fact that we haven't got enough money left in the system to help families earlier. So all of this is linked.
Yeah.
And once you start to cool that system down by making sure that children are supported to live within loving family networks where that's right, and if that's not possible, that they've got a fostering home that's very close to a normal family environment for them, if that's right for them, and that we've got specialist residential care available. And the only way we're going to get those things in place is by having really good planning, really smart investment, and services that can do the recruitment and retention of foster care as well. Only by doing all of that do you then start to get on top of the problems of profiteering and reduce the profiteering in the system substantially. Now, that's what the evidence points to. That's a very similar conclusion to that of the Competition and Markets Authority that have looked at this. And within a short space of time, within 5 years, we will be able to get on top of this problem, curb profiteering. And where there are independent fostering agencies that have got a role to play in the system because they've got a particular bespoke focus, then it's for the regional care cooperative to say, okay, we want you to help us find these carers in this part of the area.
Because it's not binary, is it? When you look at IFAs, I mean, I work for an IFA, so I'm gonna wave my little flag.
Yeah.
It's not binary that IFAs are bad. We see that the standards of IFAs are, almost exclusively good or above, that they offer a specialist service. And I have a problem. It's the profit gouging. It's when local authorities, a Friday afternoon, they've got nowhere else to go and they have to pay above and beyond reasonable costs to get a child assessment.
Because of what's called spot purchasing, because of a lack of planning in the system. And so these things are all connected. And this is why I think, conversations about this, we've tried in the review not to be ideological about it, but simply say, as a principle, this is wrong. We shouldn't have a system that's based on profit that is behaving in this way. In the future, it will be for regional care cooperatives to say, right, look, as as Greater Manchester, use that as an example, we're going to have as 10 local authorities in 5 years. We think we're going to have children with these kind of needs that need these kinds of homes. And how are we going to find and create that that version of care in the future that we can be proud of and that children desperately need? Those are conversations that do not take place in that way at the moment in the system. And it might well be that the answer to that question involves independent fostering agencies playing a role as part of that. And that will be for regional care cooperatives to determine.
That's a fair answer. I mean, it's all in there, but it's nice to hear from your voice. We're running out of time, and I think we've got two really key points we want to talk about. One being adoption, because we asked our community, hey, what do you think?
Yeah.
And they had both feelings, didn't they, Scott?
They did, yeah. And just to kind of say, Josh, I think it is great that you picked up on this kind of profiteering, because it is an issue. And, if you look at the adoption sector, whilst people think that the UK adoption sector makes a profit, the majority of voluntary adoption agencies are charities. Yeah. In fact, I think most, like all of them are actually. I don't think I've come across one that's actually a not-for-profit or a charity. Yeah. So, I know it's a different kind of approach, because obviously you might need you might need a placement on Friday night and need to use those kind of different agencies. But there are a number of companies making a lot of money out of this, and that is very unfair. Anyway, I'll leave that one go. So in terms of adoption then, I mean, one of the recommendations, adoption actually wasn't mentioned too much in the report, and we've kind of surmised that that's due to the fact that adoption has had a lot of attention over the last few years in comparison to, fostering and all that sort of stuff. However, there was a mention on in terms of contact arrangements, and it's I'll just read it out for those that may not have got that far in the report. Contact arrangements between birth parents, adopted children, and adoptive parents should be assumed by default and modernised through the swift rollout of the technology-enabled method of contact, such as letter swap. So, can you kind of give us a little bit of a background to that, and does it kind of connect in with a lifelong support thing, or is it just literally modernising letterbox contact?
It's broader than that. We had this really amazing session as part of the review, which picked up on themes that we'd heard through other workshops that we'd ran. But we did a workshop with some adoptive parents and some. In fact, Al, did you come to it?
I was just thinking, I was at that. I just remembered. Yeah. That's embarrassing.
I think you were there. I think you were there. I think you were at it. So,
I don't know where it is half the time, to be fair.
I'd go at the opening of an envelope, honestly.
You need to now say it was a great event, Al, because
amazingly chaired by the care experienced people.
Yes, exactly. It was.
And you were there.
I was there. I was an attendee, and it was birth parents, adoptive parents, and some adoptees, and it was a conversation from all of those perspectives, really, about what needed to change. And there was in the virtual room, there was pretty deep consensus that there's a fairy tale version of adoption that we're still promoting as a country, which is that children leave their birth families and then the slate is wiped and a new life begins. And that, for lots of adoptive parents, starts to unravel when those children become teenagers. And for those teenage children starts to really make them struggle with their sense of identity and who they are and their sense of self-worth. And for the birth parents, feels cruel. And this isn't serving anybody. This isn't serving anyone in the process, least of all the children. If you take a children's rights perspective to it, which is a healthy way to look at this question, that right to a family life and a right to know about your heritage and your family history, I think leads you to this conclusion. Now, what I was always curious about in making this recommendation was, what would that mean for prospective adopters? So people are coming into, potentially do an amazing thing of adopt a child, which can be absolutely the best option for some children. And I think if we are really kind of open about this in those processes and talk about it and say it is by default, I think lots of adopters would go with that process. I think there'll be questions about it and how to handle it, how to make it work. But at the moment, we've got a system that's a bit apologetic about it. Like we say to adopters, look, it would be great if you were open to that, because it could be really good for children. And actually some of the evidence is quite strong on that. There was an evaluation which we referenced in the report from Australia about some of these more open adoptions. So I think it's a bit of a culture change about saying adoption in the 21st century with forms of communication that we've currently got mean that this will inevitably happen. So we either have a system that's built to make it successful contact and managed and supported for the majority of children, or it will happen anyway, as it's happening at the moment, and it just wreaks havoc on children's lives, birth parents, adoptive families. So that's one of the big things we think needs to change. And one of the reasons why we kind of zoom in on that is it does link to other changes we're recommending as part of putting lifelong loving relationships and connection at the heart of the system. And as you say, adoption has been given, significant attention over the last few years. So there's lots of other things in the works already on that.
Excellent. No, that rings true. Does it ring true to you, Scott?
I mean, I've got loads more questions, but we need to. I'm always conscious of time. We're never. I mean, half the questions we've got written down, we're not going to get round to. So it does ring true. I guess there was an element of disappointment in terms of adults who've been adopted, who, we're hoping for maybe a little bit more in terms of the support that they can access and things like that. So I wouldn't say that's a surprise. That's a very common thing that's been discussed at the moment, and I'm sure that was covered in your workshop to some extent. I don't know.
Yeah.
Smashing. Right, I've got two. One's a quick, one's a yes or no answer, and one is a and one is a conversation. So the first one is care leaver as a protected characteristic. Is it going to happen or not?
Yes.
Excellent.
Can I say some more words?
No, you can't. Sorry, it's not how it works. We're running out of time, and the next one needs more words. So I'm just going to, that's like headline.
My point is, it will happen. I think it will happen. I think the progress shows through other extensions of rights for other groups over time, the direction of travel, if people are prepared to fight for it, is that this heads in the right direction. It will happen. I hope it happens in the next year or two. If it doesn't, it will happen in the next decade if people are prepared to fight for it, and I think they will be.
Right.
Yeah. I'd say I did like it, and I'm sorry, Al, I know you're thinking about time, but if Josh is yakking on, then we can all yak on. I think if you look at some of the kind of, the other kind of groups of people, and I include myself within the LGBTQ community, the traveling community, all that sort of stuff, it's an equality thing, isn't it? And if you've had kind of an adverse experience as a child that has meant that you've spent time in the care system, or maybe all your life in the care system, then it should be protected, because there's so much stigma attached to it, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Excellent. We can all agree on that one. I'm sure some people won't, but we'll go for it. Okay, the last one, and the one that I think is probably, in some ways I shouldn't have left this to last, but it's the one about independent reviewing officers, independent advocacy.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the one where people have all gone, what the hell? where's this come from? And then looked where it's come from and gone, yeah, well, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So having read it though, what I'm seeing is people commenting, and I'm not necessarily there commenting on what you've actually written. Can you make sense of it? What are you actually talking about when you sort of, the recommendation is an independent, opt-out, high-quality advocacy for children in care and in proceedings should replace the existing independent reviewing officer and Regulation 44 visitor roles?
Yes. So all the functions at the moment in the system, all the functions should continue to be done, which is somebody should be making a best interest assessment for children as part of their care planning and review process. So children in care, making sure they get what they need from where they're living and the support that they're getting. Somebody needs to make an assessment of what their best interest is.
So what's the opt-out bit?
Well, so hang on. So the other functions that need to be there are when children are in a residential setting, that needs a child to be, and that home to be checked every month at least, because so much of their life is driven by what goes on in that home. So that function should continue. And the other function that should continue and actually be dramatically extended is that children in care should have the right to an advocate. Now, they have that at the moment, but very few children actually access it or know what it is. So at the moment, it's opt-in, the advocacy support. And we're saying that every child in care should have an advocate given to them. So an advocate should call them up and say, and meet them, say, here's what I do, here's my role. And if children don't feel they need that or don't want it, they can opt out of it. But at the moment, they have to opt into it. So they have to know what an advocate is. They have to have some other adult connect them with the service usually. And in lots of parts of the country, the majority of the parts of the country, advocacy services do not meet some basic standards.
Yeah, but the way it reads that this opt-out service is going to replace an IRO. And my experience of IROs, and so I've been a supervising social worker, registered manager for 9 years. My experience of IROs is overwhelmingly positive. That they draw lines in the sand, they hold people to account, they often have long-term relationships with children. And I sat and tried to think of a bad example, and I could only think of good ones. So I think it really raised my concerns that when I looked at your reference as well, you've got the OAS and NARI review, which wasn't really a review, it was a stock take, government-led. And then the next quotation was like 2012, and I thought, where's the contemporary evidence for IROs not doing a great job?
Well, look, go back to the point I was making there, the functions should all still be done. And then when you look at the system and who's doing those functions, it's a messy picture. You've got social workers who are trained and qualified, supervised, managed, quality assured, inspected to surely make best interest assessment for the child. You've got, well, I mean, you can.
I'm shrugging my shoulders.
It is valid to and about it, but at some point, I think you need to say, do we have confidence in social workers or not to make sure children's best interests are understood and promoted in the system? And the development of the IRO role historically is one based on not having the confidence in social workers to do that, to then create a separate team of social workers to independently, although employed by the same council, so inherently there's a tension there in that independence, to oversee that process, and often oversee that process not knowing the child because they only see them every 6 months often. And they are, often they're really experienced, very, very good social workers. So this is not a reflection on them, but it's simply saying that for a child who is in care to have very recently had a CAFCAS guardian, have a social worker, have the manager of the social worker, have an IRO, have a Reg 44 visitor and an advocate, to then say that that's a system based on deep quality relationships with professionals that we trust who've got the time to do what's right for children. It doesn't stack up, and that's the conclusion that I've reached. And I think it's fine to say, NARIO well, there's a reason people keep coming back to this question. And it's not malice. It's because the system objectively, how it's structured, doesn't make sense at the moment, and it can be done better.
But I mean, and I've talked to a few people, and what I see is IROs they hold everyone to account, and they sit in this really critical position. And I've seen them, hold social workers when there is, social workers' turnover is much quicker. IROs isn't as quick. And it just feels like that's the wrong person to take out. If you were going to choose which one, that's just my perspective. 9 years working in this sector and talking to colleagues as well. That's the one where everyone's gone, blimey, the conversation of my social workers coming back to me going, the IRO kicked everyone's backside because things have drifted.
Well, that isn't. I mean, the thing is, that isn't a universal. That's really good. That's your experience of it. It isn't a universal experience that. I've spoken to lots of social workers who've said there is a problem there in that this role is based on not having confidence in the social workers to do what should be a core part of their role. And children who've often said, I don't know who my IRO is. I don't know their name. And I think, look, to go back to the functions point, like there is a role that the IRO plays that needs to continue being played in the future, independently and genuinely independently, which is in those meetings and in other settings, somebody who is exclusively there to ensure that the child's view, their experience of what's going on is heard in a robust and challenging and independent way. And at the moment, we don't have that. Advocates are provided by local authorities or contracted out by local authorities. IROs are employees of the local authority. And it's why children have said to the review, despite the fact that there are all of these different roles, they don't feel like their voices are heard in the care system often enough.
Yeah. I'm not sure we will agree on this because I think that my experience is that the IRO review is that role. Children, I respectfully suggest that children, and they may not comprehend the full extent of their system and how it's working, but I've seen our IROs work with children over 6, 7, 8 years. And yes, the child, if you ask the child, what's the name of your son, they'll go, oh, that lady, what's her face, But what I see is that
I think that's fair, and I've heard the same as well. Al. I've heard, and I've sat in on care review meetings and met brilliant IROs.
Absolutely, but they do more than just ensure that the child's voice is heard. What they do is they ensure that they hold people to account for the work they're doing in a way that is very immediate and prescient, and in a room saying, supervising social worker, what have you done? Well, you child social worker, what? I asked you to do this, why haven't you done it? Or you said you were going to do this. They review the care plan and make sure that everyone is on board with that, and they might add actions but hold people to account. And that's different to advocating for a child's voice. It's ultimately, it's a bit bigger, but it's advocating for a child.
So in the review, in the report, we say that some of the work of the IRO would go to social workers. So I think some of what you're describing there, Al, I would expect social workers to be doing that. And some of it would go to an advocate. Well, but I think that is really telling. If you're sort of thinking, well, maybe social workers can't do that, where's our concern about that?
Oh, I'm having a cow about that. Talking, the only job you can get as a social worker straight from university is in child protection or children and families. Yeah. You can't walk into fostering or adoption, or you can't. It's the main feeder. We're taking our greenest, fantastic people leaving university, so it's not a diss on them. But we're taking our least experienced professionals and putting them in probably some of the most complicated scenarios where the stakes are really high.
Exactly.
So that whole culture of look at the other things the review's recommending alongside this, right? Which is, we're saying this change shouldn't happen immediately. It should take a number of years, and it should be carefully rolled out and implemented alongside
a massive expansion of genuinely independent advocacy for children, and alongside a huge program of professional development for social workers. The 5-year early career framework, family help, meaning we have more stability in the social work workforce, a wider range of professionals who can do some of the work.
Set in that context, set in that context, it makes it. I can see it makes more sense. My concern is that the government goes, "Hey, we can just slice out a whole group of professionals," and that's my anxiety. Is if we start to, because you've asked for whole system change, if we start to if someone cherry picks and goes, "Oh, we like that bit, we like that bit," it's destined to fail, isn't it? Because you're saying it's all or nothing.
Yeah, there's a critical path with this recommendation, which is as you say, it's based on building the confidence and support for social workers, and a number of other recommendations as well. Yeah, look, I get why it's controversial. I get why, particularly people that are in those roles at the moment would be concerned about this.
Yeah.
My starting point is I don't think the current system is the right one to be defending. I think it does need to be better. I think on the tests of independence, on the tests of trusting the social work workforce, on the test of having the fewest but deepest possible relationships around a child who's in care, the current system doesn't do well enough at passing those tests. And that means you need to set out an alternative. And it might well be that people come up with, now that we've published this, they might say, actually, there's a different way of doing this. There's a better way of doing this. And you could take that approach to all of the recommendations. And that's, the phase that we're going to go into next.
So what? Yeah, I need to go and have a talk to myself because I'm all vexed now.
I think it's that we challenged this because it came up for me as well. Ours was a lot better than I would, and my experience of IROs isn't the best, I wouldn't say, but it's not the worst either. But just the thought, if you take it out of context and just see that an IRO isn't going to happen for a child, you can understand the panic in that. And of course, some people do take a lot of stuff out of context. So I think it's right that we ask that.
Just one more, and we need to wrap up, don't we? But just one more thing on Al. You're giving me a look.
No, it's your. I mean, I'm happy to keep going, but I'm aware that you've got work, and my employer's probably going to come and drag me out of a room and say, "What the heck are you doing in there?"
Yeah.
I'm on sick leave, so I'm all right. I can do this all day.
Okay. Well, be careful because we'll get another coffee and carry on for another hour.
Part two.
I think there is an idea that when you zoom into one bit of the system and you think, actually, if we create a specialist role or a specialist team to meet this need, this isn't just about IROs, this is about the whole system, that if we do that, that will fix or solve this one problem. And if I could list out all of the examples of that in the review that we heard about, people coming to us and saying, reunification practice, children being in care who then go back home, is so poor. What we need is specialist reunification teams. Or what we need is special teams to work with young parents who themselves are in care, and special teams to work with, and you could basically list out an enormous array of specialist teams. The problem with that starts to be that at a certain point in time, and you risk creating a system which has so many handoffs and people involved in a family's life or a child's life. It doesn't create extra responsibility taking. It doesn't make the people doing the work feel that they've got responsibility for the outcome. It narrows it down and actually makes the system as a whole less responsible for that child or for that family. And I think there is a bit of that going on in this part of the system of care around children, where you've got lots of different people involved. Some of their roles are sort of slightly overlapping and in tension. And I do think that can undermine the sense of responsibility taking for children. So the intention of the recommendation is to strengthen that system around children for both making sure their views are well advocated in the system and making sure that they've got their interests being understood and being met. and I appreciate that, you know, is generating debate, but that's definitely the intention.
But then it should be debated anyway, shouldn't it? I mean,
it should. There's lots in it. Lots in it to debate.
Well, thanks for coming.
We have run out of time for everybody, really. But, you know, there's loads of other questions we had. Those were our priority questions. So, you know, anybody who wants to kind of have a go at us, sorry about that, but that's just the way life goes, unfortunately. But Josh, sorry, was that a little dig?
That was a dig. We did get trolled, but we've mentioned that before.
I don't think you two don't get trolled.
We do.
Oh, I got really trolled. It was really exciting.
That's a proper troll at the minute. We'll tell you about that when we finish recording. But, but Josh, listen, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate your time. We know that you and everybody involved in this has done a lot of work. It's not going to please everybody, but you know, when is that ever going to happen in life? But from my perspective, thank you for coming on, and thank you for all the hard work that everybody's done. And the Experts by Experience group, you know, done. You know, given up that time and done an amazing job in terms of getting involved and stuff.
Well, and taking some slack.
They have, and this whole work is filled with amazing people. We've had thousands of people contribute to the review over the last 15 months, given their time really generously. You two run this podcast for free. You know, you don't get paid for doing it.
Well, Scott doesn't.
and you do it so that people who are fostering and adopting can feel like part of a community and learn some stuff along the way. So thank you to you for doing it and for having me back again for a second time.
Yeah.
Should we get you back in another year and we can see what's happened?
Yeah.
I'd be happy to come back again.
You'll have to ask your employer, who will probably be McDonald's at that point. You'll have to ask if you can have the morning off.
Yeah.
March.
I tell you what, McDonald's has got a very good track record on high skilled
graduates.
And good discount as well. So I've heard, and freebies.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, you know, winner chicken dinner. Well, not chicken dinner.
Winner Big Mac dinner.
Big Mac dinner. Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Josh.
Go on and on. Thanks very much.
We'll talk soon.
Thank you so much, Josh.
See you later.